Greetings and thanks for tuning in. I'm Maura Wheeler from Lamoille South Supervisory Union, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th episode of our PLP Pathways webinar series. I'd like to thank Orca Media for letting us film the show in their studio.
Hi, and I'm Don Taylor from Main Street Middle School right here in Montpelier. And before we get into today's show, we want to make sure you know how to stay connected to PLP Pathways. You can visit our website by Googling PLP Pathways. You can follow us on Twitter or also on Google+, and we also have a blog that we update on a regular basis with issues related to Act 77. We'll show you these again at the end of the show. It's an interesting time of year. Most of us just came off a fairly long midwinter break, and we've been moving through Act 77 throughout the year. Maura is going to talk a little bit about some project-based learning, but before we get into that, every month we host a Google Hangout for Vermont educators, and this pre-recorded segment will fit right into an extended discussion that we'll have next Thursday, March 15th, about project-based learning and some of the structures that we're exploring and using in our own classrooms to create curriculum around Act 77. And prior to this recording, Maura and I were talking about the different topics that we've covered so far this year, both in our show and also on the webinar. And we started way back in September with the 3 pillars of Act 77, which are PLPs, proficiency-based learning, and flexible pathways. We talked about goals and reflection and setting up those structures. Student-led conferences, proficiency-based learning. We had a student-negotiated curriculum. We've had Sam Nelson from Shelburne come on. We've had Kate Tolan come on and talk about proficiency-based learning. And then last month we talked about flexible pathways and developing community partnerships with folks who can bring those added community connections to your classroom and your curriculum. And today we wanted to maybe step a little bit back and look at some of the structures we're using in our classrooms, and again, project-based learning being central to that. And so I guess I'll start with you, Maura. What do you think about when we talk about project-based learning? What did that look like in your classroom, and what are you seeing in classrooms that you're visiting and working with now related to Act 77?
So when I think about project-based learning now, one of the things that I'm seeing more and more is this PBL squared. So it's project-based, proficiency-based learning. And so providing opportunities that are grounded in the proficiencies, those skills that the students are working towards meeting, and then embedding in that the project-based design. And so really looking at developing student inquiry and structuring projects with our students. And there are different forms of project-based learning, everything from a structured, guided, the teacher determines the topic and the way that the student is going to show their learning, into this more student-centered project-based learning or negotiated curriculum where the students are coming up with themes and topics and how they're going to display their learning. But at the heart of all of that comes back to the proficiencies, so having those clear standards for the students that they're working towards.
One of the things that, as you talk about that I find interesting is I tend to go back and review the standards and the assessments that we've had in place. And I think teachers working with Act 77, there's some flexibility built in terms of using student input to create those projects. And for me, we just completed a unit on the DACA and the Dreamers Act. And I realized that I needed to have kids write an argument paper because we hadn't done that. So that's a Common Core standard. It's a writing genre that's really important. So I started with, okay, the students expressed an interest in DACA, and then I said, we need to do the proficiency in the argument writing. I put those two together, and then I created some essential questions. I had the students use the question formulation technique to develop some of those inquiry skills, and then we moved forward with that. But in that encapsulation, I think there's a couple things that we wanted to pull out and talk about tonight. So I really like the way that you talk about PBL squared, where you have proficiencies sort of driving what the teacher needs to structure, but then also incorporating some of that project-based learning with different levels of student voice and choice, which is those flexible pathways. It could also be using the negotiated curriculum, etc. So I guess just to hear more from you, how are your teachers, when they start looking at the proficiencies, which you say it's grounded in, how do they map out the proficiencies across the year, and how does that then translate into some of this curriculum development?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we talk with our teachers about a lot is about mapping their year. Mm-hmm. So there's different iterations that our teachers go through. The first would be to map the year. Usually it happens, they look at the concepts or themes that they're going to be studying. So that could potentially be a topic in science that they're working at. They then align those topics or themes with the actual proficiencies, the standards, and they'll map that across their year to identify any gaps. It's also a great time for teachers to meet within their interdisciplinary teams and see if maybe there's some overlap of some of the proficiencies and have some interdisciplinary opportunities. But once a teacher sort of maps their year and really looks at those concepts, themes, and proficiencies, they then would go in and look at one of those learning cycles or one of those units, and they would then map that out. They would map out the opportunities. So what are the essential questions? What are some performance task opportunities? Opportunities for students to have multiple exposures to developing the skill. And then also to design their performance assessments. So how will the student show that they have grown in the skill? So the first step is really that big global, looking at the whole year and then breaking it up into those segments. And then when we talk about the project-based learning component or the curriculum design framework, that would be within one of those units or learning cycles.
And I think what's interesting is you just described another topic that we wanted to mention tonight, which is the understanding by the design, or that backwards design, where you start out with, what are these big essential questions, and then you look at what are the skills they need to answer those questions. And I think for me, this is also layered on top of the personal learning framework and the identity, the growth and reflection, and the evidence that is going to demonstrate student learning, which then can be presented on the PLPs. So it is fairly complex, right?
Yes.
And I don't want to, gloss that over. But as teachers are thinking, and we've talked a lot about Act 77, and now we're started talking about nuts and bolts, about mapping your year, about looking at the proficiencies, about looking at the skills, and then figuring out, how do I go backwards from maybe these summative assessments? How do I put these in place so that we're scaffolding to meet the needs of all students? And I think that's really important for people to see how these different structures are working together to create a learning environment that's allowing kids to have some voice and choice, but also to work towards these proficiencies that the school and the teachers have. These are important. These are what we need to move forward. I also think it's important to remember the transferable skills and how those transferable skills can play into all aspects of this. And so using the projects and the project-based learning, I think is a really easy way to integrate many of the different topics that we've talked about, the flexible pathways. Those project-based learning can also become community-based learning. You can use community partners to help you create curriculum around that. You can also really use the proficiencies, as you mentioned, to sort of drive the learning. The one other topic that I wanted to bring up tonight was the universal design for learning, which I think I'm not an expert on it by any means. I'm starting to accumulate resources. And what's interesting about the universal design for learning, as I was mentioning before, is that it is integrated into the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it's recognized as a best practice. And for those of you out there who are using it, that's great. I'd love to tap into your expertise. But you can also go to the CAST organization. They have a ton of resources around this. And basically there's three elements. There's the engagement, representation, the action and expression. How are we engaging kids? How are we making sure that they have important goals, that they're using self-assessment and reflection, that they have choice? How are we representing the learning so that we're addressing the needs of multiple different learning styles? And finally, how are we allowing kids to represent their learning in a wide range of formats so that they can put their best foot forward? And I guess as you look at it as a curriculum sort of person who's helping support teachers, how would you structure this for teachers, or where would you start? Taking all the Act 77, you talked about proficiencies quite a bit. What would you, as you're mentoring your teachers, what's sort of the progression through some of these different structures?
I think when I think about designing curriculum, I think about all the layers. So just as we talked about how there's so many layers at the different levels, both within the year, within a unit cycle, within a daily learning cycle for our learners, we keep laying different components on top of it. And so whether you're starting with the proficiency or the theme, the content that you're working on, you then would lay over the voice and choice for your students. And then you'd think about what is the authentic audience that they could have. And so I think the universal design dovetails really nicely with those pieces because it keeps it in the forefront of our minds as we're backwards designing and creating those multiple means of representation, opportunities for kids. It really allows for that student flexibility, which increases engagement. And so as we think about planning, it is thinking about all of these layers that we're adding on. But I think it really helps to keep us moving in the right direction and being really clear with our students about what the outcomes are that we're looking for.
Yep, and I would just add to that too, the transferable skills can be emphasized throughout all of that, and that the PLP becomes instrumental in showcasing what the students are able to achieve and their levels of proficiency. And without those PLPs, I think we lose not only portability between grades, but we also lose the progression of the students. And I just think that's really critical. None of this is easy work, that's for sure. And I think that's why these discussions are so valuable, is it allows us to kind of figure out how they're all tied together and to continue making those connections to deepen our understanding. Again, this is just a sort of a primer. We're going to be dissecting these topics next Thursday. Again, we'll be looking at project-based learning and how that can tie to Act 77. We'll be looking at the universal design for learning. We'll be talking about understanding by design and backwards planning. One thing I do want to mention before we close, and this is not my idea, but this came up at a conference. When you're introduced to a new initiative, so the Universal Design for Learning, they have a 2.0 graphic. I would really encourage people as a first step to take that graphic and look at what you're already doing and start checking off all the things that you're already doing. And I would encourage people to do that with project-based learning, with the backwards design, because many teachers are already doing all of these things. And it's not that you will have to continue working hard, but I think that gives me a sense of relief when I can go through and start checking off these things. Oh yeah, I'm doing this, and here's where I'm integrating this skill, and here's where the proficiencies are driving what we're doing. And I think sometimes by doing that, by reflecting and going back and taking it easy, it maybe de-stresses teachers a little bit. And that's just a practice that I've started to incorporate into my own teaching. And I would maybe recommend that for folks too, as a way of saying, hey, what am I already doing in this initiative? And are they calling what I'm already doing just a different, is the nomenclature changing? So again, if you'd like to learn more about these topics, please tune in next Thursday, March 15th. Again, we'd like to thank Orca Media and the Middle Grades Collaborative and the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education for supporting this work. We hope everybody had a good winter break and is relaxed and ready to go for the rest of the year. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks very much.